In the previous video, we had a look at the echo and print language constructs and how to use them in order to output some string into a browser. As much fun as it was, it's certainly not the most exciting feature that PHP has to offer. In this video, we are going to have a look at the variables, one of the most basic elements of any programming language. Variables are a storage location, which is usually associated with some value. Its value may change over time depending on the situation in which the given variable is used. Let's now try and declare a few variables using some of the most common data types. The first data type we're going to be using is a string. We've used string in a previous video as well, and what string is actually a sequence of characters. Strings are delimited by either single or double quotes. That's why we always enclose them within either double or single quotes, as we did in a previous video. In order to declare a new variable, if we create a few new lines here, we're using a $sign and then the name of the variable we want to declare. In this case, it's going to be a title. So title, we use lowercase, or in case of a camel case, which is basically when you've got more than one word that you need to use to declare the variable, let's say title of the movie, this is the camel case, and the camel case is represented by the first word is all lowercase, and all the following words, the first letter of each subsequent word is capital. You can also use snake case, which is basically replacing this with underscores, so underscore of the movie. And this is also the way to declare the variables. But for the time being, I only need the title, so just one word is going to be just fine. So this is the variable, and now I want to associate the value with it. In order to associate any value with the variable, we're using the equal symbol. And then because it's a string, I'm going to use double quotes. You can also use single quotes as explained earlier. And what string I'm going to put here? You can put absolutely anything. Obviously, we are just playing with this code here. So I'm going to put PHP course. And then semicolon at the end of this line to indicate this is the end of the statement. And now what can I do with this variable? The easiest thing I can do is basically echo it in a browser. So let's use echo, language construct, and then title variable. And now what happens? This value, because it's associated with this variable, whenever I use this title variable, this is what it's going to return. So echo, if I save it and preview it in a browser, if I refresh the page, you can see PHP course is what we see. If we now go back to the editor, the next type, let's actually put some comments above it so we know what we're dealing with here. So this is a string type. Then we're going to go for the integer type. So integer type. And what we're going to call this variable? This variable, let's call it a year. And then equal, and what do we want to assign with this is 2015, for instance. Integers are simple whole numbers, basically. Anything that's not decimal, so it's like 1, 12, 256, whatever else. Obviously, in this case, I'm using the year, so it's 2015. And now again, the same thing. If I want to echo this, I can simply use echo year, and now semicolon at the end to indicate the end of the statement. And again, if we preview it in a browser, if I refresh, you can see we've got PHP course and then 2015. Again, we don't have a space because we haven't declared a space within a string. Obviously, as you may remember, PHP ignores any space outside of the statement, outside of any string value, basically. So if we go back to the editor again, and this time if we, after the PHP course, if we just put the space, because if we put the space here, that obviously this is obviously going to be ignored by PHP parser. We could also put double quotes or single quotes here, create the space and concatenate it with a full stop. So this would work as well, but obviously we don't need it for the title, we need this for the year, so we can do it here with this to concatenate. If I now save it and go back to the browser, refresh it, you can see this space is now reflected in the browser here. So let's go back to the editor again. The next type of the data we are going to be dealing is the floating point. So floating point number. Floating point is simply a decimal number. So whatever has any decimal point, that's the floating point number. And what we can call this variable to associate the floating point value with it. Let's call it a price, for instance, price of the product, and associate the value of, say, 285. And then again, semicolon at the end, and then echo, and let's create this space so that it's basically separated from the previous one, then concatenate it with a full stop and the name of the variable, which was price. There we go, and semicolon at the end, save it, and let's go back to the browser again, refresh it, and there we go, our price is also displayed straight after the year, obviously with the space which we also added to the echo statement. Let's go back to the editor. The last data type we are going to be discussing in this video is going to be a Boolean type. Let's create a new comment, Boolean. And now Boolean either returns true or false. The representation of true or false when you echo the value in a browser is either 1 or empty string, which basically means nothing. So let's start with the new variable. Is it true? Yeah, that's a good name. Okay, and let's associate the reserved Boolean value of true, the reserved keyword true, basically, which represents Boolean true. And now if we echo the variable in a browser, but what I'm going to do before we start echoing this, let's echo as well in between the double quote, new line, and let's give it a heading perhaps, Boolean value is, and then colon, and then obviously the value is going to be displayed after this sentence. Okay, so if we save it now, let's go back to our browser. If we refresh the page, there we go, Boolean value is 1. As I said, true represents 1 when you echo it, false represents blank, empty string, which is basically nothing there. So let's go back to the editor, and let's now change this true to false. Again, another reserved keyword. So if we save it, go back to the browser, refresh it. As you can see, we can't see anything now. If we go to the page source, you can see we've got just is, and there's nothing after this. So that's the most basic approach for the Boolean, but there's more to it, and there is more to it because you can actually parse different data type as Boolean as well. And I know it might sound a little bit confusing, but let's have a look at this. First of all, what we're going to do is I'm going to wrap this false within a set of double quotes. What happens now? As you may remember, we're using double quotes to create false strings. So now this Boolean value, this reserved false keyword, has been converted into a string. What do you think we're gonna see in a browser? If I save the page and go back to our browser, refresh it, it simply returns false, because what happens? The Boolean false keyword has now been converted to a string, and it basically returns exactly what it says. So false. That's what we just put in between the double quotes, right? If we put true, the same rule is going to apply. So if we go back to the browser, refresh it, it simply returns true, because it's now not a Boolean value, it's simply a string, because we've enclosed it within the double quotes. In PHP, there is a way of converting one data type into the other by using the typecasting. What typecasting is? Basically, when we have a specific value associated with the variable and then we want to echo it or use it within any other statement, we need to precede it with brackets and then define what sort of data type we want this value, this specific variable to return. And in this case, I want to convert this string into the Boolean value. I want to see what the Boolean representation of this string is. And in order to do it, as I said, brackets and then BOOL for Boolean, closing bracket and a space. So basically we're preceding the variable with whatever data type we want this variable to represent. So if we now save it and go back to our browser, refresh the page, and you can see this specific string is represented by Boolean true, because obviously true equals 1. If we go back to our editor, let's try the same with false. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, false here is just a string, so obviously it's going to return true. It's not the Boolean representation. It's simply the string. So if we refresh it again, it's true because it's a string, and it's not an empty string. If we try with an empty string, look what's going to happen. If I just remove anything in between this from these double quotes, in which case obviously there's nothing there. If I now save it and preview it in a browser, you'll see that now we have an empty string, which means the value represented by this empty string in Boolean type is false. Let's go back to the editor and try a few different values. Let's, for instance, try a number 0. If we save it, preview in our browser, refresh, you can see again empty, which means that 0 equals false. So it's the Boolean representation of the false. If we go back, now let's try some number. Let's leave 1 because we know 1 is definitely going to be obviously true. Let's put 556, save it, go back to the browser, refresh, again, returns 1. So 556 is definitely, so positive numbers are definitely true. Now, what's going to happen if we use negative numbers? Let's use minus 556. And what do you think is going to happen? Because that's a pretty interesting one. If we go back to the browser, refresh it, and there we go. Negative numbers also return Boolean true. It's only 0 out of all of the integers that returns false. Negative or positive numbers are always true. So if we go back to the editor, another type that we can try is an array. We haven't discussed this yet. It's a topic for a little bit later. Don't worry about this. Simply type it in, array. And we're going to start with an empty array. So it's keyword array and then set of brackets. If we save it, this specific one is an empty array. That means it hasn't got any items inside of this array. So it's an empty one. Let's go and preview it in a browser, refresh it. It doesn't return anything, which means empty array is false. If we go back to the editor, and this time let's put something inside of this array, some item. Items in the array are basically separated by commas. It can be integers, it can be strings, it can be literally anything. So I'm just going to put a string something. So the first item in this and only item in this array is the string something. If we go back to our browser, refresh, it returns 1, which means array with some items, with at least one item in it, represents Boolean true. If we go back to our editor, I think we have actually discussed most of it. Just to show you, if we don't use this typecasting, what's going to happen? If I save it and go back to the browser, refresh it, it just returns array, basically indicating that obviously it is an array. So this typecasting is pretty helpful thing, obviously, whenever you want to obviously make sure that whatever you pass in is always converted to a Boolean value, and you will find situations like this. Later on, we're going to be discussing conditional statements, which is where Boolean value plays quite a significant role, and this is where this typecasting may come in handy as well. So that's roughly what Boolean values, what different types converted to Boolean represent. Now let's quickly recap and go. Let's create a comment here and just do some recap of what we've just done. So we know that true equals true. We know that false equals false. These are obviously reserved Boolean keywords. Then if we put any positive number, let's indicate this represented by 1, that gives us true. If we go for negative number, it also gives us true. If we go for 0, that's the only time that we're going to get false from the integer. Then if we put any string, let's put false, it always gives us true, unless it's an empty string, so we just put 2 double quotes without anything in between, in which case we'll get false. Then array, empty array, gives us false. An array with anything inside of it, any items that we may find basically being placed inside of the array, let's put something, all number 1 as well, that will give us true. So this is just a quick basically reminder. If you want to keep it obviously for later on, you can obviously refer to this later on when you're going to be basically working with some Boolean values in the other statements. So that's pretty much everything for this video. We will continue with the variables in the following one, because there's more to the variables than just this. So let's just jump to the next video.